Well, the year 2020 will perhaps be remembered as a year that we just don't wish to remember, isn't it? Coronavirus, COVID-19, pandemic, night curfews, lockdowns, these are words that have entered our day-to-day interactions. COVID-19 has affected businesses adversely. During the lockdowns, every business was shut. After the withdrawal of lockdown also, there are certain businesses which have permanently shut down. Businesses have contracted, businesses have been disrupted. During such a situation, it is very natural that a lessee will like to renegotiate the lease arrangement with the lessor. See, it has affected the paying capacity of the lessee. You had taken a factory shed on lease, or a building on lease, or a shop or an office premise on lease, anticipating a certain level of business. But because the business has shrunk, so has your paying capacity. In such a situation, a lessee will expect rent concessions from the lessor. Rent concessions like reduction in the lease rent, or postponement of lease rent, or if possible, a total waiver of the lease rent. Now, whenever you are renegotiating the terms and conditions of the lease arrangement, which were not a part of the original terms and conditions, Ind AS 116 considers it to be a lease modification. The accounting of lease modification, especially in the books of the lessee, is very complex. Yes, if the lease modification qualifies to be accounted for as a separate lease, then the accounting is simple. But under Ind AS 116, separate lease accounting is possible only if the scope of the lease is increasing and the consideration is also increasing commensurate to the standalone price. Now, this is not what is going to happen when you will renegotiate a lease arrangement because of the disruptions caused by the COVID-19 pandemic. The scope of the lease perhaps will be decreasing, or the consideration will be decreasing, or the consideration may remain more or less the same, but the timing of the consideration may change. In such a situation, you will not be able to account for the lease modification as a separate lease. In this kind of a situation, a lessee is expected to revisit the entire existing accounting and carry out its modification. Whatever are the lease payments which are still pending, they are required to be discounted by a revised rate. You have to work out what is the new lease liability, compare that with what is the existing lease liability, and accordingly you are supposed to carry out the lease modification accounting. As I said earlier, this is really complex. Hence, an amendment has been introduced in Ind AS 116. We will call it as an amendment of accounting of rent concessions arising due to the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, remember one thing. This amendment is only for a lessee. This amendment is not for a lessor. A lessor has to consider any change in the terms and conditions of the lease arrangement as a lease modification. But then the accounting of lease modification in the books of the lessor is comparatively simpler. It is in the books of the lessee that it is quite complex, and hence rightly an amendment has been brought in Ind AS 116, which is applicable only to a lessee. We are introducing in Ind AS 116 a practical expedient. By practical expedient, we mean a relaxation. We are giving a relaxation to the lessee that if you wish, remember, amendment is not compulsory. Amendment is saying, suggesting to the lessee that, see, if you wish, you can go for a relaxation. What is the relaxation? The relaxation is that, see, whatever changes you are making in the lease arrangement arising out of the COVID-19 pandemic, if you wish, do not consider it to be a lease modification. In other words, whatever accounting you are doing of the lease right now, continue with that same accounting. This is a relaxation that we are giving to a lessee, and it will be applicable if and only if the lessee elects to go for the relaxation. In other words, we are not making a permanent change in the Ind AS 116. We are giving an alternative. We are giving two options to the lessee. That see, because of COVID-19 pandemic, you have renegotiated the lease arrangement. Do you want to consider this as a lease modification? The lessee says, yes, I will consider it as a lease modification. Well and good. Follow the requirements of Ind AS 116 the way they are. However, the lessee says that no, I do not want to consider this as a lease modification. Then as I said, a practical expedient, a relaxation, an exemption has been given. Of course, the exemption will be available, the practical expedient will be available subject to fulfillment of certain conditions. If those conditions are getting satisfied, we will make the life of the lessee simpler, or perhaps the life of the accountant of the lessee simpler, by ensuring that the changes in the lease arrangement will not be considered to be a lease modification. So the complex requirements of Ind AS 116 relating to lease modification for a lessee shall not be applicable. So let us dive into what this particular amendment is. So this is what we are going to call it. We are saying it is amendment in accounting of the rent concession arising due to COVID-19 pandemic. We are using the word rent concessions. As I said earlier also, the rent concession can be of different types. Either the lease rent is reducing, of course for a definite period of time, the lease rent is reducing, or the lease rents are getting postponed, or the lease rent are getting waived. Whatever way it is, we will consider this as a rent concession. And remember, this rent concession should be arising out of the disruptions caused by the COVID-19 pandemic. Okay, this is the position which is existing before the amendment. As I had already told you, you are making any changes in the lease arrangement which are not a part of, right? Not a part of original terms and conditions. You have to consider that as a lease modification. Okay, yes. If a change in the lease payments results from a lease modification, then unless and until it is going to be accounted as a separate lease, a lessee is required to remeasure the lease liability by discounting the revised lease payments using a revised discount rate. So whatever are the remaining lease payments, we will be discounting it at the discount rate which is prevailing at the time of the modification. The lease liability will be remeasured. It will be compared with the old lease liability, and the difference has to be then adjusted through the ROU asset. It's pretty complex work to be done. Okay. Then as I had said earlier also, that this amendment will not affect the lessor. Right, this amendment will not affect the lessor. It is not for the lessor. The amendment is only for the lessee. Okay, what does it really say? So, following amendment, right? This is the main thing that we want to discuss now. They are saying, following amendments has been made with respect to accounting of COVID-19 related rent concession, such as rent holidays and temporary rent reductions. Okay. They say as a practical expedient. The best way to understand a practical expedient is some kind of an exemption, or we can say some kind of a relaxation. It says lessee. Remember the words, right? They say lessee may elect not to assess. They use the word may elect. We are not making it compulsory. Okay. See, we don't want to change Ind AS 116 entirely. Instead, we are giving an option. We are telling the lessee that, see, you can consider it as a lease modification if you wish, then continue in that way. But if you feel that the lease modification accounting shall be complicated, you better go for this relaxation. So this is a decision that has to be made by the lessee. So a lessee may elect not to assess a rent concession as a lease modification. You will not consider the changes made in the lease arrangement due to the COVID-19 pandemic as a lease modification. In other words, you will argue that whatever was the accounting that I was doing earlier, that same accounting shall continue. only if the following conditions are met. So three conditions are there. All the three conditions are met, then and then only you will be eligible to enjoy the benefit of this practical expedient. Okay. So what are these conditions? Fine, let's see them. The first one. The change in lease payments results in revised consideration for the lease that is substantially the same as or less than the consideration for the lease immediately preceding the change. Renegotiations are being made. Certain lease payments are getting postponed. For example, the lease rent agreed is 10,000 rupees per month. So what the lessor is saying is that for 4 months, do not pay 10,000 rupees to me. I don't have any problem. But later on, once the business has reached the pre-COVID level, at that time, I will expect that you pay a higher amount of lease rent. So as I said, 10,000 rupees was 10,000 rupees per month, which was agreed upon. It has been postponed. But later on, right, let's say after 4 months, after 5 months, whatever is that 10,000 rupees which you had not paid, you will now start paying it to the lessor. So the total consideration will remain more or less the same. Or there can be a reduction in the lease rent. The lessor says, okay, you pay me only 50% of the lease rent. I don't have any problem for so and so definite period. After that, we will again return back to the original lease rent. Here, the total consideration will turn out to be less compared to what it was originally negotiated. So they are saying that the lease payments will either remain substantially the same or it may be less than what was originally agreed upon. Okay. B, they say any reduction in lease payments affects only payments originally due on or before 30th June 2021. So whatever are the lease rents which are getting affected, this lease rent should be those lease rents which were becoming due on or before 30th June 2021. They say, for example, a rent concession would meet this condition if it results in reduced lease payments on or before the 30th June 2021 and increased lease payments that extend beyond 30th June 2021. So 30th June 2021, that we can say is working as a sunset clause. We don't want this practical expedient to remain permanently in Ind AS 116. So whatever is the reduction in the lease rent, the reduction in the lease rent should be for a period which is up to 30th June 2021 or before it. In case if there is any postponement of lease rent or there is any increase in lease rent, then that increase in the lease rent should commence beyond 30th June 2021. So remember 30th June 2021 as a sunset clause over here. After 30th June 2021, unless and until there is further amendment, we will, as a lessee, no longer enjoy the benefit of this particular exemption. And finally, they say there is no substantive change to other terms and conditions of the lease. You are basically concentrating on the lease rent rather than anything else. And that's the reason we are saying that the other terms and conditions are more or less remaining the same. The main concern of the lessee is that, see, my business has been affected. So how exactly am I supposed to now meet the lease obligations? So we are basically renegotiating, keeping only one thing in mind, and that is how the lease rents will be paid now. Will I as a lessee enjoy any reduction in the lease rent, any postponement in the lease rent, or if possible, a waiver in the lease rent? Other terms and conditions may remain as they are. So there will not be any substantive change to the other terms and conditions. We do have a pictorial representation of these conditions. This is how you can really remember. They are saying, is the rent concession a direct consequence of COVID-19 pandemic? Whatever is the concession should be a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. It should not happen that as a lessee, you are reorganizing your business and that is the reason you are renegotiating the lease arrangement. No, Whatever changes that you are making, it is because your business has been affected due to the COVID-19 pandemic. So is it because of a direct consequence of the COVID-19 pandemic? You say yes. Is the revised consideration for the lease substantially the same or less than what it was before the change? You say yes, right? The lease rent is more or less remaining the same or is getting reduced. Lease rent should not increase. If it is increasing, then this condition will not be affected. Does the rent concession affect only lease payments originally due on or before 30th June 2021? Right, as I said, any reduction after 30th June 2021 will not be eligible for the practical expedient. Yes, and then they say no substantive changes to other terms and conditions of the lease. The other terms and conditions of the lease are the same. As I said, during the COVID-19 pandemic, the only concern that the lessee will have is how shall I meet the lease obligation? Forget about the other terms and conditions. Do something about the lease rent. This will be my request. This will be my appeal to the lessor, isn't it? So if everywhere you are answering yes, then the practical expedient becomes applicable. Hence, accounting will be done as a lease modification, right? So what we are really suggesting over here, yes, they say practical expedient applicable. They say hence accounting will not be done. Okay, it should be not. Hence, accounting will not be done as a lease modification. While here they say no practical expedient is applicable, hence accounting will be done as a lease modification. So if these conditions are not getting fulfilled, then whatever changes that you have made, you will have to consider that as a lease modification. But if all these conditions are fulfilled, you will get a practical expedient, and because of the practical expedient, you will not account for it as a lease modification. You will simply consider this as accounting of the original lease only, and in that original lease itself, the changes which are necessary will be brought about. Of course, that will become more clear when we will solve the questions. And finally, a point does arise, when you say no substantive changes. Now, when you are saying no substantive changes, what do we really mean? This term substantive has not been defined in the amendments. Okay, but to be very honest, the only question that you should really ask yourself is, are you introducing these changes because of the COVID-19 pandemic? If you say that yes, these changes are because of the COVID-19 pandemic, then there is no need for you to do further analysis of whether there is any substantive changes in the terms and conditions or not. Any change that is happening in the lease arrangement due to direct consequences of COVID-19 pandemic will always be eligible for the practical expedient, provided the other conditions are getting satisfied. So we should not really do too much of analysis of substantive changes in the other terms and conditions, because as long as the amendment in the lease arrangement is due to the COVID-19 pandemic, subject to other conditions getting fulfilled, as a lessee, you will definitely like to enjoy the benefit of the practical expedient. With the help of case studies, let us analyze whether a lessee is eligible for the practical expedient, yes or no. Let's see the first case study. Retailer Q leases a store in a large retail mall. The rent payable is rupees 1 lakh per month. As a result of the COVID-19 pandemic, Q agrees with the lessor to defer the rent originally due in the month April 2020 to June 2020. As part of this arrangement, the rent for the period January 2021 to March 2021 will be increased by rupees 1,10,000 per month, which compensates the lessor for the deferred rent as adjusted for the time value of money. Whether the rent deferral is eligible for the practical expedient if the other conditions are met. We are supposed to basically analyze whether the practical expedient will be available or not. For this, we have to really analyze whether the conditions which are given in Ind AS 116, whether those conditions are getting satisfied or not. See, they are saying as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic, right? This renegotiation is happening because of the disruptions caused by the COVID-19 pandemic. So if we just analyze those conditions, right? The first one they say, is the rent concession a direct consequence of the COVID-19 pandemic? In our illustration, the answer will be yes. Okay. Is the revised consideration for the lease substantially the same or less than the consideration for the lease immediately preceding the change? Earlier, we were supposed to pay 1 lakh rupees per month. Then for certain months, we will not pay it. But later on, we'll be paying extra 1,10,000. So if we calculate the total lease payments, the total lease payments are substantially remaining the same. So we can say that the answer over here will be yes. Then they say, does the rent concession affect only lease payments originally due on or before 30th June 2021? Okay. Here they are saying that this is for rent originally due in the months April 2020 to June 2020. So this is definitely before 30th June 2021. So even that condition is also getting satisfied. And then they say no substantive changes to the other terms and conditions of the lease. So they have themselves said that there is not much change to the other conditions. So they are saying that whether the rent deferral is eligible for the practical expedient, all the conditions given in the amendment introduced in Ind AS 116 are getting fulfilled. So is it eligible? Our answer shall be yes. We do have a detailed answer over here. The rent deferral satisfies the criteria to apply the practical expedient, right? It is direct consequence of the pandemic. Increase in the rentals during January 2021 to March 2021 compensates the lessor. More or less the lease rent is remaining the same. The lease payments are originally due on before 30th June 2021. In our case, it is April to June 2020 and there are no other substantive changes. So a lessee is eligible to apply the practical expedient. Let's see one more. Lessee P operates a chain of restaurants and leases several outlets. As a result of COVID-19 pandemic, P agrees for a rent deferral with the lessor. Under the terms of the rent deferral, rent originally due in the period July 2020 to December 2020 will be added to the rent due in period July 2021 to December 2021. Whether the rent deferral is eligible for the practical expedient if the other conditions are met. Again, if you analyze this, the change in the lease arrangement is because of the COVID-19 pandemic, right? It's a direct consequence of the COVID-19 pandemic. Then they are saying rent which was originally due in July 2020 to December 2020. We will pay it from July 2021 to December 2021. So the lease rent substantially, or rather I'll use the word lease consideration. The lease consideration is substantially remaining the same. Only thing is we are delaying its payment. There is a postponement of the payment, and it is postponement of the payment of those lease liabilities or lease obligations which were due on or before 30th June 2021. Here the last lease rent which is getting postponed is the one of December 2020. So even this condition is also getting satisfied and there are no other substantive changes. Is the rent deferral eligible for the practical expedient? Our answer shall be yes. We do have a detailed answer over here. They are saying it's a rent concession occurring as a direct consequence of the pandemic. Recovery of the rentals during July 2021 to December 2021 is substantially the same or less than the consideration. Rent deferrals is for lease obligations which are originally due on on or before 30th June 2021, and there are no other substantive changes. Lessee T leases office buildings from a lessor. As a result of the COVID-19 pandemic, in September 2020, T agrees a rent concession with the lessor, under which the monthly rent will be reduced by 50% per month for the 12 months commencing from 1st October 2020. Whether the rent deferral is eligible for the practical expedient if the other conditions are met. First of all, it should be a consequence, a direct consequence of COVID-19. So they are mentioning here that as a result of COVID-19 pandemic, we are making these arrangements. So that condition is getting fulfilled. Okay. Now they are saying that the lease consideration should remain substantially the same, or it can even be less. We are going for a 50% reduction. So there is going to be a what we can say, there shall be a reduction in the lease payment. So that condition is also getting fulfilled. But the lease rent which is getting reduced should be those rents or those obligations which are due on or before 30th June 2021. Now here they are saying that this particular lease reduction will start from 1st October 2020. No problem with that. But they are saying it will go for 12 months. So I'll add 12 months over here. That means this lease concessions will continue till 30th September 2021. They are saying it should be for the lease rents which are due on or before 30th June 2021. While this will go up to September 2021. So this condition is not getting fulfilled. If this condition is not getting fulfilled, you will not be eligible for the practical expedient. Don't be of the view that till 30th June 2021, I'll enjoy the benefit of exemption or the practical expedient and then I will do lease modification. No, that will not be so. You will have to consider this as if the condition is not getting fulfilled. And if the condition is not getting fulfilled, you are not eligible to enjoy the benefit of the practical expedient. You will have to consider this as a lease modification. The complex treatment which is given in Ind AS 116, you will have to follow that particular treatment. The rent deferral does not satisfy the criteria to apply the practical expedient, because out of the listed eligibility criteria given in the Ind AS 116, rent deferral reduces lease payments starting from October 2020. That's not a problem. But the reduction will continue till September 2020, which is beyond 30th June 2021. It's very clearly mentioned that the lease obligations for which you are enjoying the concession should be due on or before 30th June 2021. Here it is due on or before 30th September 2021. So you are not permitted, right? You are not permitted to apply the practical expedient. A lessee is granted a rent concession by the lessor, whereby the lease payments for the period April 2020 to June 2020 are deferred. 3 months are added to the end of the lease term at the same monthly rent, and the lessee repays the deferred rent during those additional months. The rent concession is a direct consequence of COVID-19. Whether the rent deferral is eligible for the practical expedient. Okay, go condition wise. Condition number 1, it should be arising out of a direct consequence of COVID-19. Okay. Whatever is the total amount of lease rent, it should substantially remain the same or it may reduce. Here what they are saying is that for April 2020 to June 2020 are deferred. For 3 months you will not pay the lease rent. The lessor is saying that, see, whatever is our lease term, we will extend it by 3 months. We will extend it by 3 months. And whatever lease rent you are not paying right now, pay during those 3 months. So considering the extended lease tenure, if we now do a calculation, we realize that the total lease payments are substantially remaining the same. One more condition. The lease payment should be becoming due on or before 30th June 2021. Here we are talking about a period April 2020 to June 2020. That is much before 30th June 2021. Even that condition is also getting satisfied. But there's one more thing. They are saying no substantive changes to other terms and conditions. Question is that whether there is a substantive change over here because you are changing the lease term. You may have agreed for a particular lease term, but now the lessor is saying that, see, for 3 months you will not pay the lease rent. I am extending the lease tenure by 3 months. And during that extended period, I will recover from you my loss of income. Whether this extension of the lease term, can we say it is a substantive change to other terms and conditions? Because if you say it is a substantive change, then this condition is not getting satisfied, and as a lessee you will not be eligible for the practical expedient. So question arises, what is a substantive change? We had seen this earlier also. This term is not defined. They say the term substantive has not been defined in the amendment, but remember, practically it requires not much application of judgment. Ask yourself, is all these things happening because of a consequence of COVID-19 pandemic? Is it that as a lessee, I want this asset now for a longer period? Is it really so? Is it that as a lessee, I am like that, no, see, I will require your asset for a longer period of time, so that's the reason we are extending the lease term? No. The reason why you are extending the lease term is that for 3 months, if I am not paying the lease rent, my lessor is getting affected. So the lessor says that, can we do it so that whatever lease rent you don't pay for these 3 months, let's extend our arrangement by another 3 months so that whatever is my loss of income, you can compensate me for that loss of income during the extended lease tenure. So basically what is happening is, all these things are happening mainly on account of the COVID-19 pandemic. We are agreeing for those lease negotiations because of the disruptions caused by the pandemic. And that's the reason. That's the reason. We will not consider this to be a substantive change. It's a very logical, very rational change where the total lease payments will remain substantially the same, where the interest of the lessor is getting protected, and at the same time, the lessee is enjoying the benefit of the lease concession, or I would say the rent concession, when it really matters. So we will not give too much of importance to the fact that the lease tenure has extended. So whether the rent deferral is eligible for the practical expedient, my answer again shall be yes. Right, it is because of a direct consequence of the pandemic. Consideration is substantially the same. Rent concession is for the periods before 30th June 2021. And then they say there should not be any substantive change, no substantive change in other terms and conditions. Yes. In the given case, there is an extension of the lease term by 3 months. There is no explicit guidance on what is considered substantive. Judgment will need to be applied, considering both qualitative and quantitative factors. The lessee assesses that the 3-month extension at the end of the lease term with substantially the same lease payments would not constitute a substantive change. So since this is the conclusion that we are drawing, we suggest that the practical expedient shall be applicable to the lessee. Lessee Z entered into a lease contract with lessor L to lease 1500 square meters of retail space for 5 years. The lease commenced on 1st April 2018 and the rental payments are 1 lakh payable quarterly in advance on 1st April, 1st July, 1st October and 1st January. Z's incremental borrowing rate at the commencement of the lease is 5%, assuming that the interest rate implicit in the lease cannot be readily determined. There are no initial direct costs, lease incentives or dismantling cost. Indirectly, they are trying to tell us that ROU assets shall be measured at the present value of the lease liabilities. Z's business is severely impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic and L and Z negotiate a rent concession. On 1st June 2020, L agrees to provide Z with an unconditional rent concession that allows Z to forego the payment of its rent due on 1st July. That is, L forgives Z the rent payment of 1 lakh due on 1st July. What will be the accounting treatment in the books of the lessee for the rent concession, assuming that it is eligible for practical expedient? Whether practical expedient is available or not, that is not the subject matter of this case. That they have given directly, that the lessee is eligible for the practical expedient. They are asking us what shall be the accounting treatment. Okay. So what exactly is the rent concession that we are enjoying? Now, on 1st June 2020, rupees 1 lakh is payable. Okay. So rupees 1 lakh is payable. Lessor is saying that we are foregoing this. We are waiving this, right? So this particular amount is forgiven. So the lessor is saying, don't pay me 1 lakh for this particular quarter. That is the rent concession that I am providing. Okay. If you are following the practical expedient, then how shall this be accounted for? That's the question over here. Think of it. How shall you account for it? 1 lakh rupees is foregone by the lessor. Now see, originally when you must have made a measurement of the initial lease liability, you would have definitely taken this 1 lakh rupees. Right? You have entered into the lease on 1st April 2018. So on 1st April 2018, you must have measured the ROU asset. You must have measured the lease liability. The lease liability must have been measured on the basis of the total lease payments that are payable, and it has been discounted at the incremental rate of borrowing of 5%. This will become your lease liability. Because there is absence of other elements, your ROU asset shall be exactly equal to the lease liability. Then you must be depreciating the ROU asset in your books, and the lease liability must be getting amortized. So you must be preparing a lease liability repayment schedule. You must be recognizing interest expense in your books at 5%. That interest expense must be getting debited to the P&L. And by whatever is the amount of the lease payments, your lease liability must be reducing. So this is the accounting that you are doing right now. Now, because of the COVID-19 pandemic, the lessor has granted you a benefit. A lakh of rupees which was originally payable is now no longer payable. See, it is not even getting postponed. The lessor is not saying that you don't pay me right now, you pay me later. No, we are just not supposed to pay this 1 lakh. This 1 lakh is getting waived. So if we are following the practical expedient, you know what we should do? This 1 lakh rupees, we should treat as a negative variable lease payment. You know, this is what we should be doing. We will treat it as a negative variable lease payment. Why negative? Because instead of increasing your liability, this will reduce your lease liability. So the moment you say you don't have to pay 1 lakh rupees at all, to that extent your lease liability has been forgiven. A reduction in the lease liability is an income. It should be credited to the profit and loss account. So this 1 lakh should be debited to the lease liability and it should be credited to your P&L. So your lease liability will get extinguished by 1 lakh for a simple reason that 1 lakh is no longer payable. So obviously the liability will reduce by that amount. And because you are saving 1 lakh, it's an income for us. We should take a credit to our income statement. The effect will happen only in lease liability. it will not affect your ROU asset at all. So your ROU asset will remain as it is. Assuming that the ROU asset is not impaired, we will continue providing depreciation as we were doing it originally. That's the treatment that we can give for this practical expedient. So Z determines that the rent concession is eligible for the practical expedient. Okay. So applying the practical expedient, this amount that has been forgiven, it shall be treated as a negative variable lease payment. Okay. And we have to give its effect from 1st June 2020. So how shall it be accounted for? Yes, how shall it be accounted for? Just see. Recognize the rent concession as a variable lease payment in profit and loss account. What does that mean? Debit the lease liability. Your lease liability is getting extinguished to the extent of what you are not paying, and we should take a corresponding credit in the income statement. It should be credited to the profit and loss account. As far as the pending amount is considered, you will keep on recognizing interest expense at 5%. No need to change the incremental rate of borrowing. Quite possible on 1st June 2020, when you are introducing this concession, the discount rate may have changed. No, we will continue with the original discount rate. Okay, so what will happen because of this? Z's lease liability represents the present value of all future lease payments discounted at the unchanged incremental rate. Z has effectively de-recognized the portion of the lease liability that has been extinguished by the forgiveness. That's what I was saying. There shall be a reduction in the lease liability, but there will be no corresponding change to the ROU asset. Normally, when you account as a lease modification, lease liability and ROU asset both will change. Here only the lease liability will be affected. ROU asset will continue to remain as it is. So Z continues to depreciate the carrying amount of the ROU asset, which is unchanged as a result of the rent concession. ROU asset will remain unchanged, except all that you should really check is your ROU asset should not be impaired. So that's what they are saying, that the ROU asset is not impaired. This test should be done. In case if you come to the conclusion that the ROU asset is impaired, then impairment loss should be provided as per Ind AS 36. Otherwise, you have to continue providing depreciation on the ROU asset as if no change has taken place in the lease accounting.